لا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا. اللهم زدنا علما إنك أنت عليم الحكيم. اللهم اجعل هذه المحاضرة حجة لنا لا حجة علينا يا رب العالمين. أما بعد. Today, inshallah ta'ala, this is our 18th class in the book Zaad Al-Mustaq'ni the Musa Hajjawi rahimahullah ta'ala. This is the second part from the book or the chapter Al-Hayd, which is the menstrual cycle of a woman. Before we get into tonight's portion here, we want to quickly review the principles that we covered in the last class. Without those principles, there's no way you're going to be able to understand what we're going to discuss today. So we're going to read those. Do you remember those principles? I'll read them off again because it's people that weren't here. All right. If it's something you don't understand, stop me. We'll go over it really quick and then we'll get into the subject matter today, inshallah. Today's class, you really have to pay attention. Like really have to pay. This is not one of those you just sit and casually, nod your head off against the wall and go home. It's important, especially for the men. How many brothers here have daughters? 1, 2. How many brothers here are married? All right. So it's important that you have some knowledge of this subject. When we were in school, one of our professors, one of the mashayikh, his name was Muhammad Al-Harbi, Sheikh Muhammad Al-Harbi in Mecca. He told us, he said, it's important for the men to understand these issues. So at the time, we're like, why? Like, this is not something that affects us. And he said, well, how would you feel? Your wife and your daughter have to go to another man, potentially, and ask them about their bleeding. Like, how would that make you feel? So we're looking like, that's not cool, right? So having said that, it's important that the men, if you have daughters, wives, etc., you need to understand this. So the first thing we're going to cover, like we covered last week, the principles, right? What are the principles of the menstruation cycle? The first thing is لا حيض قبل التسعة, that a woman does not have her mens before the age of what? Before the age of 9. Good. The second one, ولا بعد 50, and she doesn't have her mens after the age of what? 50 in general. However, depending on where you're from, some women may still get their mens after 50. The third one, لا مع حمل, that she doesn't get her mens if she is pregnant. Make sure we follow along with these principles because they're going to come up again. All right. It says, وَأَقَلَّ الْحَيْض يَوْمٌ وَلَيْلَةٌ, the smallest or the least amount of days that a woman can have her mens is how many days? 1 day and 1 night. That means if it starts half of the day and is going by the other half of the day, does she still have her mens? Is that considered a mens? Yes or no? Let's say a person, she started bleeding today, 6 o'clock in the morning. By 6 o'clock in the afternoon, or 6 o'clock, she started bleeding 6 o'clock in the morning. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she stopped bleeding. Is that considered her mens? No. It has to be what? Yom wa layla, a day and a night, 24-hour period. Are we clear on that? That's important because it's going to come back again. The next one, أكثره 15 يوما, the longest time period a woman can have her mens is how long? I'm sorry? Is that plugged up, Sheikh? Is it over there? You know how to connect it? All right. The longest a woman's mens can be on is how many days? 15 days. That's the longest. What that means is if a woman's bleeding for 20 days, how many of those days would we consider mens and how many of those days would not be considered mens? 15 days would be what? Mens, and the other 5 would be? It's called irregular bleeding. In Arabic, they will call it mustahada, but for the sake of English, we want to call it irregular bleeding. Irregular. All right? All right. The next one. So that was the 5th principle. The 6th principle is ghalibahu sit o sab'a. What's the normal range that a woman will have her mens? What's the normal? 6 or 7 days. Good. It says aqallu tuhrin bayna al-haydatayn 13 yawman. If a woman has her mens for 15 days, the next mens can come on how long? How long after those 15 days can her mens come on again? 13 days. Can it come on before that? So what if her mens was on for 15 days, it went off for 10 days, and it comes on again on the 11th day after that? Can we call that mens? I'm asking everyone here. Can we call that? All right. If her menses was on for 15 days, right? Then it goes off. And then 10 days later, she starts bleeding again. Can we call that mens? No. What is that blood? Irregular bleeding. 13 days go by and it comes on again. Can we call that mens? Yes. Is that clear? All right. The next one, the 9th one. The 9th one, it says, La hadda li aktharihi. There's no limit to the extent or the time frame between one mens ending and another one. What that means is, assuming that her mens was on for 15 days, right? After the 15 days, her mens doesn't come on again for another 3 months. There's no limit, meaning Islam doesn't set any parameters for that. If her mens comes on, and she's known to get a mens, it may come next month. It may come the month and a half. It may come 3 months. And this is important because if a brother in this city in particular, people think if they divorce their wives and she gets a mens, they think it's only 3 months. Her iddah period is 3 months. But in reality, if she is a woman who gets her menses, then her iddah period is 3 menstrual cycles. So that means it could be 3 months. It could be 6 months. It could be 9 months, depending on how long it takes for those 3 menstrual cycles to conclude. Are we clear on that? Right. The 9th one, taqdi sawm wala salat. If she is on her menses, she has to make up her fasting, but not her what? Not her prayer. Good. And the 10th one, la yasihani minha bal yahruman. That fasting and praying while she's on her menses is haram. Fasting and praying while she's on her menses is haram, impermissible. All right. Any questions about those 10? All right. So as we continue with the new part here, we're going to come back to that. So if there's anything that's unclear, let me know now. Otherwise, buckle up. Put your seatbelts on. Before we get into it, we're going to mention 10 or some other benefits as it relates to the mens.
I have a question.
Yes.
If you think your mens come on, you said it takes it's 24 hours. If it comes on at 6 and it goes off at 3, you didn't pray all that time. Does the woman have to make up the salat?
We'll get back to that. We'll get to that. Hold that question towards the end, inshallah. In essence, well, let's go back to that. In essence, because this is quick. If you are bleeding during that time and we determine that it's not menstrual blood, then you have to make it up. The only time you don't have to make the salat up is if we determine that it is mens blood. If it's irregular bleeding, a woman still has to pray even though it's irregular bleeding. Is that clear? But we're going to talk about that by the time we finish this section today. Inshallah, that issue would have been answered. It says, We're going to mention about 9 things that are impermissible for a woman when she gets her mens. We didn't mention this last week, but we're going to mention it today. The first thing, a lot of them we already know, some of them we may not know. The first thing is a salat. A woman can't pray. We know that. The second one, a som. She can't fast. We know that. The third thing is she can't make tawaf. Tawaf around the Kaaba. We know that. The fourth thing, qira'at al-Quran. She cannot read the Quran. Some of the scholars may differ on that. When they say read the Quran, they mean read the Quran from memory. Some say that. The fifth one, masul mushaf, that they can't read from the Quran, like touch the Quran, right? You can't touch the Quran. That's the fifth one. The sixth one, lubth fil masjid. Many scholars say that if a woman is on her menses, she cannot sit in the masjid. The seventh one is having intercourse. It's actually 8. And then the eighth one is al-idda bil ashhur. If a woman gets her mens, she cannot have the idda by saying that your idda is 3 months. That your idda is 3 months. Does that make sense? If a woman gets her menses, you cannot tell her your idda period is 3 months. What is her idda period? 3 menstrual cycles, not 3 months. Did I lose you?
Yeah, I might be tripping, I think.
Or maybe not.
Yeah, no. But I feel like we already went over that. So
We did go over it.
Yeah, so I think I'm tripping.
What are you tripping about?
You can't tell her you want to divorce if she's on her cycle. So
No. We're not. No. But let's say a man divorces his wife. He says you're divorced, right? Her idda period is not 3 months. We just said this. Her idda period is 3 cycles. Understand? That's it. All right. So the next part here, I'm going to mention it briefly, and then we're going to come back and speak about them in detail. So the ulama, when they talk about a woman mens, when they speak about a woman's mens, they always start off with a woman that is considered a mubtada'a. Al-mubtada'a is a woman that never got her mens before. She's new to getting her mens. So then there are rules pertaining to that. So we have a mubtada'a. A mubtada'a, there are 3 types. We have a woman that the first type is a woman who gets her mens, or she's just getting her mens, and she's not bleeding irregularly. Is that clear? A woman that gets her mens for the first time and she's not bleeding irregularly. Is that clear? Right. The second one is al-mubtada'a mustahada mumayyiza. This means it's the same type of woman. She's new to getting her mens. However, she also has irregular bleeding. And she has something else that's called mumayyiza, which means that the blood is distinguishable. So a person might ask, what does distinguishable blood mean? That means some of it might be dark red, black, and some of it might be light red. Is that clear? The color changes. That's the second type. Go ahead. Your face is twisted. Go ahead, Sheikh. Ask me. Make sense? All right. So the first type is a mustahada. The first type is a mubtada'a, a beginner in getting her cycle, right? And she does not bleed irregularly. Does that make sense? It does not make sense. Irregular, not the cycle being irregular, just bleeding anyway, just bleeding. So we're going to get back to that. That's a good question. We're going to get back to that because in order to establish a woman's menstrual cycle, it has to go on for 3 months. And we're going to talk about that later. But just in general, if a woman's bleeding and she's bleeding, and, obviously it may be men's blood, it may be irregular blood. So they're saying that a beginner person that bleeds and her blood is distinguishable. Remember, how long can a mens be? How long can a woman's mens be? Huh? What's the longest a woman's mens can be? There's no limit? Yes, salam. I told everybody, pay attention to the principles. What's the longest? 15. That means that the only way we can consider her blood to be irregular is that it has to what? Sister, the only way we consider her blood to be irregular is that her blood has to what? It has to be longer than 15 days. Does that make sense? Okay. So then, she's a beginner bleeding. Her mens is new to her. So the mother, she's looking, okay, you started on this day on the 1st of the month and it going all the way up to the 20th. She will be considered a beginner, irregular bleeding, and if the blood is distinguishable, then it's considered mumayyiza, which means that her blood is distinguishable. Are we clear on that? Is that clear? Okay, that's the second type. The third type, mubtada'a, she's also a beginner, right? Mustahada, and she bleeds irregularly. However, her blood is not distinguishable, meaning you cannot determine whether it's light blood, dark blood. There's no distinguishing. It's the same. Are we clear on that? Okay. All right. So we're gonna start with those three, and then we're gonna move on to the next three. Any questions? Thank you. Then we're gonna read through the text.
And this is just 3 types of beginners?
Yes, 3 types of beginners. And then we're going to move into the women that are not beginners. All right. قال مصنف رحمه الله تعالى والمبتدأة تجلس أقله ثم تغتسل وتصلي فإن انقطع لأكثره فما دون اغتسلت عند انقطاعه. All right. This part here, whoever is following along, if you have the book in English, you can follow along. It says the beginner woman here. This means she's a beginner. It's not irregular bleeding. It's a beginner and it's not irregular bleeding. Okay. So they say when a woman first gets her mens for the very first time, this is according to the school of Imam Ahmed, right? When a woman first gets her mens for the very first time, let's say it started January 1st. January 1st. We're not going to use Islamic calendar because it may confuse some people. All right. You can say the 1st of Muharram or January 1st, whatever you want to do. But the thing is, it starts on the 1st. It says, Al-Mubtada'a tajlisu aqallahu. That once she starts bleeding, she sits for the lowest amount of days for her mens. That means if she starts bleeding on the 1st of January and her bleeding goes all the way out into the 5th or the 6th, they said tajlisu aqalluhu, meaning she sits for the least amount of days for her mens, that she don't pray and fast. What does that mean to you all? What's the least amount of days a woman can have her mens? 1 day. So what they're saying is she sit the first day her mens comes on and is on for that whole day, assume that it's her mens. Then she's not going to pray and fast for that 1 day. And then she's going to take a shower, make a ghusl, and then come back and pray the 2nd day, the 3rd day, the 4th day, and the 5th day, even though she's still bleeding. They're not going to consider that mens blood, right? Just follow along with me. Then once it ends on the 5th day, she's going to make a ghusl again because she stopped bleeding altogether. Are we clear on that? Any questions about that? We're only talking about beginners right now. Any questions about that? Your face is twisted. Yes.
When you reiterate that, I mean, like this, like special
No, it's cool. It took me like 3 days to go over this, so I get it. Mubtada'a, beginner. Just say beginner, right? She's a beginner and she doesn't have irregular bleeding. So let's give an example again. She starts bleeding on the 1st of January, and let's say she bleeds all the way into the 6th or the 7th, right? But they're saying if this is her first mens, they're saying that she sits for 1 day and 1 night. That means she doesn't pray and she doesn't fast for that 1 day. Once that day is over, the next day she's going to make a ghusl and pray for the next 6 days, wherever long her mens is on. Once it's over, then she's going to what? Make another ghusl and go on about her way. According to the school of Imam Ahmed, she's going to do that for 3 consecutive months. Why? Because according to the school of Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, it's not established in his madhab. It says it's not established. It doesn't la yathbut illa bitikrar. There's a principle in the school of Imam Ahmed. It's not affirmed until you have tikrar. Tikrar means it happens multiple times. Multiple times is 3 times. Once she gets her mens like this for 3 months, okay, so let's say it happens, she bleeds for the first 5 days this month. Real quick. She bleeds for the first 5 days this month. The next month, she bleeds for the first 3 days. The next month, she bleeds for 7 days. How many days is her mens? You have to. No, not average it. Whatever 3 days that they all agreed on. When would her mens be? How many days will her mens be? Let's do it again. She bleeds on the 1st to the 5th on the first month. The next month, she bleeds from the 1st to the 3rd. The 3rd month, she bleeds from the 1st to the 7th. What days will her mens be? The 1st to the 3rd. So then, according to the school of Imam Ahmed, her mens will only be from the 1st to the 3rd. Is that clear? That's not clear.
I'm thinking of like, what if it comes on late?
We didn't get there yet.
Okay, all right.
How does a beginner person that gets their menses, how does it come on late when they don't know when it comes on to begin with?
That's what I think I'm having trouble understanding.
You can only say it comes on late if you're accustomed to having your mens.
That's what I'm saying. If it came on, how can we say that it's from the 1st to the 3rd if it came on 3 different times?
So understand what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a woman who is getting her mens for the very first time. So before those 3 months, she doesn't have anything else to go by. The first time her mens comes on in January is from the 1st to the 5th. February, the 1st to the 3rd. March, the 1st to the 7th. According to the school of Imam Ahmed, there has to be tikrar, which means it has to be reoccurring for 3 consecutive months to determine her days of when her mens would be. Based on that, what days will her mens be considered? What days? The 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd. Why? Because those 3 days are agreed upon by those 3 months. Meaning in January, February, March, it was 3. Okay? Yes, those are the 3 consistent days. Does that make sense? Yes.
So a beginner is going to get their cycle every month, and then it might switch.
Assuming it might be every other month. It's just the principle, just mentioning the principle. All right. So it says aqallahu, meaning, so she's going to sit though. Understand, if this happens for the first month, she's only going to not pray 1 day. The 2nd month, she's only not going to pray 1 day. The 3rd month, she's only not going to pray 1 day. And then the 4th month, then she's going to sit all those days. The problem with that is, it says, aqallahu thumma taqtasu wa tusalli. After that, then she prays, right? So what if we find out that she prayed and she fasted on the days that she was supposed to be her days for mens? She doesn't have to make those salat up, but she has to make up what? The fast. Is that clear? or no? All right. Yes, the first to the third, right? And she doesn't have irregular bleeding. Are we clear? All right. And then it says, فَإِنْ انْقَطَعَ لِأَكْثَرِهِ فَمَا دُونَ اغْتَسَلَتْ عِنْدَ انْقِطَاعِهِ. Yes.
You saying she doesn't have irregular bleeding?
Yeah, we're not talking about the irregular bleeding yet. We're just talking about a beginner that have no irregular bleeding and it comes 3 months.
And the regular bleeder it looks just like regular blood.
Irregular bleeding?
No, regular. It's just like, say somebody, you get like a scratch, you start bleeding. You saying like it's gonna be regular blood?
But right now we're not.
I don't know.
So what are you asking me?
You saying so that's if it's not a irregular bleeder, right?
Irregular bleeding means irregular bleeding doesn't have anything to do with the color. In this point, irregular bleeding means you bleed beyond 15 days. Yeah. So when we're talking about a woman bleeding irregularly, this means she's bleeding outside of the time of her mens, or she's bleeding more than 15 days, or continuous bleeding. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Sisters, any questions? All right, so it says, فَإِن تَكَرَّرَ ثَلَاثًا فَحِيضٌ. If this happens 3 times a month, 3 times over 3 months, then this is considered her mens. Once it happens 3 months in a row, then this is considered her mens. This is a position of Imam Ahmed and Hanbal, but then he also has another position, and this is the position that a lot of the scholars do follow. The only reason why I'm mentioning this first one is because it's in the text here. The other position is whenever she bleeds, she sits down and consider all those days her mens. That's easy. So when we studied this in the university, many of the scholars say, okay, even though that's another position, but you need to understand this one as well. So I gave you guys the harder one, but there's an easier one. The easier one with Imam Ahmed is that once, if she's a beginner bleeder and she starts bleeding, then that becomes her mens right away, along those best. But so now we're going to move to the next branch. What was the next branch of beginner? A beginner that is what? It says a beginner. She's beginning in what? She's a beginner and she has irregular bleeding. And this is the second one. This is number 2. She's bleeding and she has irregular bleeding. She's a beginner and she has irregular bleeding and it's distinguishable, meaning she can look at it and see the differences in the color of the blood. Maybe it's dark, it's light, etc. Are we clear on that? All right.
You said she is a irregular. No. Yeah, she is an irregular bleeder.
Yes, she's a beginner. All of these women now are all beginners. You have a beginner that doesn't have irregular bleeding, and we have a beginner that does have irregular bleeding. What is irregular bleeding? She bleeds over 15 days. Okay? Any questions about that? So that we agree that she's an irregular bleeder, but the blood is distinguishable, meaning she can determine the different colors in it. It's not all the same. Okay? So it says, وَإِنْ عَبَّرَ أَكْثَرَهُ فَمُسْتَحَاضَةٌ. So let's say, for example, she's a beginner, because the sister said, well, how would we know if it's irregular if she never bled before? It's a good question, right? So he says, وَإِنْ عَبَّرَ أَكْثَرَهُ, that if she bleeds longer than the longest amount of time, that's considered mens. That means she bled longer than how many days? 15. It says, وَإِنْ عَبَّرَ أَكْثَرَهُ فَمُسْتَحَاضَةٌ. If she bleeds longer than 15 days, the new beginner, then that bleeding is considered irregular. It's considered irregular, right? فَإِنْ كَانَ بَعْضُ دَمِهَا أَحْمَرٌ. They said, and if some of the blood is red, وَبَعْضُهُ أَسْوَدٌ, and some of it is black, وَلَمْ يَعْبُرْ أَكْثَرُهُ, and it doesn't go beyond, meaning the black does not go beyond 15 days, وَلَمْ يَنْقُصْ عَنْ أَقَلِّهِ فَهُوَ حَيْضٌ, and the black blood does not is not less than 1 day and 1 night, then this is considered her mens. What does that mean? Let's say, for example, we have a new beginner that's bleeding, right? She started bleeding on the 1st of January all the way up until the 20th. The 1st up until when? The 20th. The dark blood started on the 1st. It goes from the 1st all the way up into the 10th. All right? Then after the 10th, I'm sorry, it goes from the 1st all the way up into the 15th, the dark blood. And then after the 15th, it turns into the light red blood, right? They say that from the 1st to the 15th, that would be her mens, and the blood after that, that would be what? Irregular. Likewise, if she starts on the 1st up until the 7th or the 8th, and then it's dark, and then after that, it turns light. That first time would be, the first dark would be the what? The mens, and the light part is still be considered mens up until when? The 15th. And then after that will be considered what? Irregular. Is that clear? Yes. Mumtaz. Regardless of the color, if she bleeds for that long, for the 15, that would be considered the mens, and anything after that would be considered irregular. Anything after that would be considered irregular. Any questions? Did I lose anybody? All right. All right, so it says, well, tajlisu fi shahr. So a thani. So the same thing. If this happens for the first month for the new beginner, then she sits for the second month, and it says, wa ahmar istihada. And that red blood, they're saying the red blood would be considered the mustahada, the irregular bleeding, like we mentioned. The third part is a beginner who bleeds. Her blood is non-distinguishable. You don't know whether it's the light blood or the dark blood. You don't know. There's no way she can tell the difference. Right? This is the third type. So it says, وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ دَمُهَا مُتَمَيِّزًا قَعَدَتْ غَالِبَ الْحَيْض مِنْ كُلِّ شَهْرٍ. In this case, if she does not know whether or not the blood is, you can't distinguish. So let's say she starts on the 1st, she goes all the way up until the 20th, bleeding. We don't know what's what. Then we what? We stop at the, it says, وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ دَمُهَا مُتَمَيِّزًا فَقَعْدَ الْغَالِبَ الشَّهْرِ مِنْ كُلِّ شَهْرٍ. So this means that she sits. In this case, remember, we're talking about a woman that has irregular bleeding. This means that she sits for ghaliba to hayd. That means she sits for, what's the average amount of time for a woman to have her mens? Huh? 6 or 7 days. So that means if she has irregular bleeding like this and it's recognized and there's no way to make a distinction between it, then she sits, meaning she doesn't pray or fast the normal amount of days, which is what? 6 or 7. And she does that for how long? 3 months. 3 months. Why? Because she's still a beginner. She's still a beginner.
Wait, if it's irregular, then she gonna sit for the 6 or 7 for the first 2 months.
Yes.
So I'm confused because we don't know it's irregular until after 15 days.
Well, the thing about it is, in this case, is we're talking about a woman that has irregular bleeding. That means for the first month, we already knew that was irregular. So it came again the next month. And exactly. Remember, we don't know if it's irregular until she what? Until it's after 15 days. So anytime you hear them say it's irregular, it's already established that it now here's another point, right? We also know, let's say after the 15 days, let's say she didn't bleed for 15 days. She only bled for 7 days, right? And then her mens went off, and then it came back in 10 days and she started bleeding. What would that blood be? Would that be irregular or mens? Who say mens? Raise your hand. Why would that blood be mens? Nope. It hasn't been 13 days. This is why I told you guys you have to remember the principles. The least amount of time between two mens periods for a woman is how many days? 13 days. So let's say she had her mens for 7 days. It goes off. 10 days later, she starts bleeding again. Is that blood considered mens or irregular? Irregular. Why? Because it hasn't been 13 days. Does that make sense? All right.
Basically, she got 2 menstrual cycles in 1 month.
Yeah, she got 2 menstrual cycles in 1 month. Yes, it's possible. Okay. So now we're going to switch to the so we mentioned 3. So now we're going to mention 3 more categories of women in their menses. It's like, hold up. I wrote this down to make it easy. Huh? Allah test the women, man. We're not tested with this. Allah Musta'an. So the first group, it says Mustahada Mu'tada. So here, all of these women get their regular mens, meaning they're not beginners. They've been getting their mens. All right? They're not beginners, and they've been getting their mens. However, in all 3 cases, these women get irregular bleeding. They get what? Irregular bleeding. So the first group is a woman who gets irregular. She has a regular cycle with irregular bleeding. Does that make sense? A regular cycle with irregular bleeding. And the blood is mumayyiz, meaning she knows what her mens is. She knows that even though she has irregular bleeding, but she understands between this day and these days are her mens. Yes.
So when they say irregular bleeding, how you said it's established, is it also established that it's the regular bleeding of longer than 15 days? Like, because you just gave an example of how if it goes off and then it starts back up in less than 13, that's considered irregular too.
Yes.
So is this irregular? Is it just the regular of past 15 days?
It could be either or.
Okay.
Right? It could be either or. Either way, they're both considered irregular, right? Does that make sense? So it could be that it's bleeding past 15, or it could be is bleeding, she bleeds again in less than 13, meaning less than 13 days between menstrual periods. Either way, we consider what? Irregular. So the first one is Mustahaba Mu'tada Mumayyiz. This woman, she has a regular cycle. She has irregular bleeding, and her blood is distinguishable, meaning she can distinguish the colors of the blood. In this case, they say tajlisu adatiha, meaning meaning she sits the normal amount of days that she would normally sit. So that means, let's say, like, give an example. The 1st of January, she bleeds the whole 30 days. There's some women that bleed like that. But she knows that her mens is usually, and she can determine, is from the 1st to the 7th is dark, and then after that it gets real light. So they say sit for the 1st to the 7th, the days that she knows where she can distinguish the blood. That should be easy, right? I mean, we wouldn't know. I don't know. But to women, that may make sense, right? All right. The next one. Is that clear? All right. The second group. It says
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
How can you have a regular cycle with irregular bleeding if irregular bleeding is considered if it's within the 13 but after the 15?
Okay, so the first part of your question, how can you have a regular cycle with irregular bleeding?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, so what they consider a regular cycle, meaning this is a woman that consistently has her mens, and all of a sudden she became irregular with bleeding. Does she not still know the days that her mens would usually come on? Yes?
They had a meet.
Can you say that again, please?
All right. Your question was, how can a woman have a regular cycle with irregular bleeding? Right?
Yes. What is that? Yes.
What is that? Okay. So before she became irregular, she knew the days that her mens would come on. Right? So let's say every month for the past 5 years, for example, her mens would come on from the 1st to the 6th every month. Now all of a sudden she has irregular bleeding. So now she has irregular bleeding every month for 30 days or 20 days, etc. She knows that usually the 1st to the 7th would be her days of her mens, and she can also distinguish between the different blood. So in this case, she would sit out, meaning she would not pray and fast on the days that would normally be considered her days for having her mens. That's what that means. Meaning she knows her cycle. She knows when it comes on every month.
She knows her cycle,
But the blood is irregular.
it's irregular. Past the days that
Yes. Does that make sense?
yeah. I don't know if it makes sense to you. She only
I'm sister to ask the question. Does that make sense? So let's try to figure it out together. Because I hear y'all talking. Let's teamwork make the dream work. What are y'all saying? And then what are we saying?
they going from experience with
No, that's what I'm saying. That's why I said, what are you saying?
different periods, different menstrual cycles.
So it might make sense to us because we don't go through it. Oh, yeah, that's easy. I get it.
One of the 3 categories.
Did the answer make sense?
So they just
So you asked a question, but then I'm trying to get some feedback.
I'm sorry, because we was over here. I just don't want to take up the time because I personally still don't understand
Okay, what part don't you understand?
the actual. So an example I was just given was if I know my cycle is 1 to 7 days last month, and then this month it's
No.
10.
Now you're talking about something different. That's a whole different scenario. We didn't get there yet. So here's how about this? Hold the questions till we finish the whole part, and then because right now you guys are talking about, well, you don't know your cycle now. Well, then now you're not. This is a whole different category of that. We didn't get to that category yet. All right. So the next category. It says مستحاضة معتادة متميز نسيت ترجع إلى تمييز. So in this case, the same situation, but she knows her cycle. She has a regular cycle. However, she has irregular bleeding and she forgot her days. She don't know whether, meaning she bleeds, like, let's say, for example, she's bleeding every month for 20 something days. It's been like that. She doesn't really remember what days was her cycle days because she's had irregular bleeding for so long. So she's like, man, was it the beginning of the month? Was it the middle? I'm not sure. So in this case, they say that she goes back to looking at her blood and distinguishing between the colors. Whatever the dark. So let's say, for example, it starts on the 1st. From the 1st to the 20th, the first 7 days is dark and the other days are light. Then those are going to be her mens days, the dark color. Did that make sense? Why? Because she forgot the actual day. She wasn't sure whether it's the beginning of the month, the middle of the month, the end of the month. She forgot. But she also has irregular bleeding. She has what? Irregular bleeding. The third one. What part lost you? From the very beginning?
The second principle.
The second one was just like the first one. The only difference is she forgot her days that she usually would sit out, or her cycle would be on. She forgot the days of the month. She forgot what, and the only way she could find out is by looking at the distinction in the blood. That's the only way she would know. She forgot. No, we didn't talk about that yet. She just forgot when her cycle came on.
Oh, this is the solution. She would then look at the dark color.
Yes. So remember, and we're gonna go over this again, right? So the third one, مستحاضة معتادة غير متميز ونسيت تجلس غالب الحيض. So the third type is a woman who has excessive bleeding or irregular bleeding again. She can't distinguish between the color and she forgot the days in which her mens was on. What do you do in that case?
15 days.
No, in this case, then she would consider her cycle to be 6 or 7 days because this is what the normal amount of time would be. It makes sense? So then we'll go over these three again and then we'll go back to the text. So we have a woman who, all three of these women know that they get their cycles. The first case, she knows exactly when her cycle is and she knows the days of it, but she has irregular bleeding. In that case, she doesn't pray and fast her normal time, even though she's bleeding longer than that, but she knows when her time usually is, and that's what she moves on. And the second one, just like the first one, except she forgot the days. She forgot what days it was on. So how does she remedy that? She looks at the blood and makes a distinction between the blood. The third one is that it's just like the previous one, but she forgot the days and she cannot distinguish between the color of the blood. In this case, she will consider her mens to be 6 or 7 days because this is the average time that we mentioned before with the principles. Does that make sense? All right, now we're going to go to the text. So the Qala Musannif rahimahullah. So the author, he says, wal mustahadatu al mu'tadatu walau mumayyizatun tajlisu 'adataha. He says that a woman that has she knows her cycle and she has irregular bleeding, then she will sit out, meaning she will consider her mens to be her normal days. It says, wa in nasiyatha amilat bitamyiz as-salih. If she forgets it, then she looks at the blood and make a distinction looking at the blood, the color. Meaning if it's dark, then it's considered mens, and it becomes light, then it's not considered the mens. It says, فَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ تَمْيِيزًا فَغَالِبَ الْحَيْض. They said that if she looks and she cannot make a distinction between the color, that she would sit out the normal amount of times for a mens. Some of the scholars say, instead of it just being 6 or 7 days, she would sit out the normal days. Sit out means that she would consider her mens, sit out of the salat and fasting. This would mean, some say that she will go back to what's normal for the women in her family. So, for example, in her family, the average woman may have their mens for 12 days. So instead of sitting out 6 or 7, not praying and fasting, they'll say, all right, well, you do what the women in your family do, which is 12. That's just another way of looking at it. Right. And it says, likewise, this is similar to a person. The next issue is a person that knows likewise, a woman who knows mawdi' hayd. So if a woman who knows what part of the month her mens comes on, but she's not sure of the number of days, right? But she forgot the number of days. Similar, she has to look at it and look at the blood, right? And then it says, وَإِنْ عَلِمَتْ عَدَدَهُ وَنَسِيَتْ مَوْضِعِهِ مِنَ الشَّهْرِ. Or a woman who knows the number of days, meaning she says, well, my mens usually comes on 7 days a month, but I'm not sure whether it's the beginning of the month, the middle of the month, or the end of the month. Because she has what? Irregular bleeding. So she knows, like, usually my mens comes on for 7 days. but I forget whether it's in the beginning of the month, the middle of the month, or towards the end of the month. Right? Then it says, "Walau fi nisfihi jalasat min awwalihi." If this is the case, then these women have to sit, meaning don't pray and fast, starting from the beginning of the month. Again, it says a woman who knows when her mens comes on, but she doesn't know the days. The other one was she knows the number of days, but she doesn't know when in the month, the beginning of the month, the middle of the month, or the end of the month. According to the school of Imam Ahmed, it says she should sit from the beginning of the month and start from that time. Yes.
I know for example purposes we use like the American calendar, but in that case where she could that'd be the Hijri month.
It would be the Hijri month, whatever month that you're going to use. A lot of people don't know the Hijri month.
Okay.
That's the only reason why I mentioned the Gregorian calendar, because realistically speaking, I can't see people trying to learn the Islamic calendar real quick and to try to figure that out. Even if you ask most women about when their mens come on, they don't use they use the Gregorian calendar, the calendar that they're familiar with.
I know that's what I'm saying, but like this, I thought it was kids calendar.
طيب. And they say in this case, the woman is kaman la adata laha wala tamyiz. This one will be treated as if she didn't know when her cycle would be, and she can't make a distinction between them. This is the ruling on that particular case. Does that make sense? I see long faces.
So she know how many days she can give a distinction between the blood.
No, listen. The first case is a woman who knows when her mens comes during the month, meaning she knows it's in the middle of the month, every month, right? But nasiya li adadihi, but she forgot the number of days. Was it 4 days? Was it 10 days? Was it 15 days? She forgot the number of days that her mens is on. Then there's another scenario. Wa in alimat adadahu, or she knows the number of days, meaning she knows her mens comes on 13 days every month or 14 days every month, right? Lakin wa nasiyat mawdi'ihi, but she forgot when it happens. Is it the beginning of the month? Is it the middle of the month or the end of the month? It says, walau fi nisfihi, even if it's the middle of the month, jalasatha min awwalihi, then she should start when soon as she sees the blood in the beginning of the month. That's when she should start sitting out for her hayd, for her mens. It says, وَمَنْ زَادَتْ عَادَتُهَا أَوْ تَقَدَّمَتْ أَوْ تَأَخَّرَتْ فَمَا تَكَرَّرَ ثَلَاثًا فَحِيدٌ وَمَا نَقَصَ عَنَ الْعَادَةِ طُهْرٌ. All right, so now it says, وَمَنْ زَادَتْ عَادَتُهَا. Let's say, for example, a person or a woman increased the days of her mens. It started only 4 days and then it goes up to 6 days, right? Or let's say her mens started coming on earlier. Like say last month it started on the 5th. Next month it starts on the 1st, right? It says, or ta'akhara, or it came towards the end of the month and not in the beginning of the month. They say, فَمَا تَكَرَّرَ ثَلَاثًا فَحِيدٌ. They said, if this happens 3 consecutive months, remember the first principle they mentioned, then this is what? This is considered her mens. If this happens 3 consecutive months, then this is considered her mens. It says, وَمَا نَقَصَ عَنْ عَادَةِ طُهْرٌ. And whatever is less than, let's say, for example, before it was 7 days, now it's 4 days. Then she takes a ghusl after the 4 days, and the rest is considered pure, meaning she doesn't have, it's not considered her mens. Now, here's the thing. All of this is according to the school of Imam Ahmed, right? The Bab al-Hayd, the issue of the women menstruation cycle, Imam Ahmed himself said it took him 11 years to dabt the Bab, to understand this chapter. He's a man, he's not even a woman, rahimahullah. However, you're going to find when you read this on your own, this is a technical, detailed look at it. It's very possible that you could read somewhere else. It may be a lot easier. But these are the things that women need to know. And as men, we don't really know this like that. I'm talking to you men saying it makes sense. Everybody, yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. But we don't live it. That's not our reality, right? So speak to your daughters, your wives, etc., and learn more about these issues because in some cases, each woman is different. Perhaps this month her mens comes on this day. According to this, it says that she has to do it 3 months, and then that's considered her mens. Well, what if it changes again on the 4th month? What if it changes again on the 5th month? What if this? What if that? So in that case, some of the scholars say whenever she bleeds, then that's considered her mens as long as it doesn't go past 15 days. That seems easier, right? As long as it doesn't go past 15 days. And the minimum amount of time has to be what? 1 day. If it goes beyond 15 days, then it's what? Irregular blood. That's an easier way to understand it. And Allah knows best. He made it detailed according to the madhab. They made it detailed, right? All right. So the next part here is, let's say, for example, and here's an example. Let's say a woman, she gets her normal mens. All right. Her mens comes on the 1st, goes off on the 5th. But her mens usually lasts for 8 days, but it went off on the 5th. Does she make a ghusl and start praying and fasting? Yes. So what if her mens comes back on the 11th? Is this considered mens? It's not considered mens? Why not? The shortest is 1 day. The longest is how many days? 15. I said it came on from the 1st to the 8th. Then it came back on the 11th. It went off from the 8th to the 11th. It's ahsant. Excellent. It's still her mens because it didn't exceed the 15 days. It's still within the 15 days. Sheikh, he paying attention. Yes. So let's say, for example, again, let's say her mens came on for 1 day, 2 days. It went off. I told you guys, what's the longest amount of time that has to be between 2 menses? 13 days. So let's say her mens came back on. It was on for 1 day and 1 night, and then it comes on the 10th. So the first of the month, it was on and it went off. So you got the 2nd all the way up to the 10th. Then it comes back on the 10th. Is that still her mens? Yes. If it goes past the 15th, is it still her mens? No. Why? Because the longest the mens can be is how long? 15 days. In that period. Is that clear? Right.
No.
It's not clear.
Stop bleeding and it's still a mess as long as it's under 15 days.
Yes, as long as it's in that 15, as long as it's in that time frame. So she can bleed for 2 days, stop bleeding, her mens is off. Then if it comes back again within that 15 days, then it's considered mens again. Well, so listen, he said. So the principle is that the longest the mens can be is how long, and the smallest amount of time between each mens is what? No, 13. So as long as those two principles are upheld, anything that happens between there, then we know where to categorize it. That was the purpose of understanding the principles in the beginning. Yes.
When it comes on and goes back off like that, say it's like a 3-day span of it being off and then it comes back on. Say if the sister was fasting.
Did she ask fasting during the days where she was praying?
Yeah, where she thought it was like,
She doesn't have to make it up because those days are considered pure.
okay, that's all.
Yeah. But if it returns within those days, then it still falls into her mens. Make sense now? Tell you. It goes back to those principles. Because here's the thing. If you have those principles, it will help you along the way with this. If you don't have if this is the first time you're listening to this, it may sound like a foreign language. But if you have those, this is why you always have to hold on to principles. Principles will guide you along the way. Even if you don't know the answer right away, if you hold on to those principles, you'll be able to figure it out a little bit. طيب.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
So there's one principle that says the most amount of days that a woman can bleed is 15. And then there's
Yes.
another principle that says the least amount of time between 2 months is 13 days.
Yes.
So I don't understand, because if a woman's mens comes on for 2 days, goes off, and then 2 days later it comes back on, that's not 13 days.
So so it takes the principle of being connected to the first mens because it's within the time period.
I understand.
Yeah. So remember, a woman cannot have a mens less than 13 days, meaning she can't have two separate menses less than 13 days apart. All right. So the next part.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
This is to piggyback off her question.
I'm sorry?
This is to piggyback off her question. So let's say you're normal, like you said, and then within 4 days your mens go off and your husband wants to divorce you. Because it's still within that 15.
You need a fatwa. Hello, Allah. That's a good question. That's a really good question. Write that down and send that up. We gotta look that up. That's a really good question. That's a good one. Sisters always ask the good questions. That's a real good. No, what she said was, I mean, I'm not giving no fatwa, but what she said, huh? No. Her question was, remember, a woman cannot be divorced during her mens. All right. So just right now, we're just going to play it out. Ta'leem, like we're studying this, not giving no fatwas, right? If a woman has her mens for 1 or 2 days and it goes off, right? So the husband said, you meant, yeah, 1 off 2 days, bet you're divorced. Then it comes back on 3 days later and it's within that time period. Does that count as talaq? I mean, it's either way, it's going to count as a talaq. But is it a bid'ah or is it sunnah? That's the issue. Is it bid'ah or sunnah? No. Yeah, we got. What do you mean regular? Sheikh, let's finish this, man. We can talk about divorce later. طيب. All right, so it says, وَالصُّفْرَةُ وَقُدْرَةُ فِي زَمَنِ الْعَادَةِ حَيْضٌ. So even if a woman, if her mens went off, her mens is usually 7 days, right? So she bleeds the first day, the second day, the third day, but then the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, she's spotting. It's like light color, but it's within the time that her usual mens is. That is still considered her mens, right? And it says, وَمَنْ رَأَتْ يَوْمًا دَمًا وَيَوْمًا نَقَاءً فَالدَّمْ حَيْضٌ وَالنِّقَاء طُهْرٌ وَلَمْ يَعْبُرُ أَكْثَرُهُ مَا لَمْ يَعْبُرُ أَكْثَرُهُ. So it says, وَمَنْ رَأَتْ يَوْمًا دَمًا. So whoever sees a day when it's blood, and then another day is pure, meaning she's not bleeding. The فَالدَّمْ حَيْض, the blood is considered her mens, and the days that she's not bleeding is considered pure, as long as it doesn't exceed 15 days. So we already said it. I'm just reading it. So I'm saying, no, don't daydream, man. Get yourself together. Listen, the first day, there's 7 days. 1 day she's bleeding. The next day she's not. Next day she's bleeding. Next day she's not. As long as it's within the 15 days, the days that she's bleeding is her mens. The days that she's not, she can pray and fast. Simple. Don't make it too hard. Go ahead, who's going to ask you?
So, if she's married and her husband wanted to be intimate, could she on the day that
on the days that, according to the days that she pure, everything, the rules is removed then because it's considered pure, right? طيب. وَالْمُسْتَحَاضَةُ وَنَحْوِهَا. So now they're going to talk about the woman that has irregular bleeding. What should she do? Just in general, a woman that has irregular bleeding, what does she do? Irregular bleeding, وَنَحْوِهَا تَغْسِلُ فَرْجَهَا. She should wash her private areas. وَتَعْصُبُهُ وَتَوَضَّأُ wash her private areas, use whatever women do to use whatever pads, whatever she does. And she makes wudu li waqtin li kulli salat. And she does this for every salat. Wash herself, make wudu li waqti kulli salat. She does this for every salat. Wa tusalli furudan wa nawafil. She does this for every salat. Is that clear? So that means she has to make wudu. So if a woman has irregular bleeding, her menses is off now, but she's still bleeding, right? Do she pray and fast? Does she pray and fast? Yes. She has to make wudu for every salat. She has to clean herself for every salat. Is that clear? طيب. And then it says, وَلَا تُطَعُ إِلَّا مَا خَوْفَ الْعَنَتِ. All right. In this case, you do not have intercourse with a woman that has irregular bleeding. You should not have intercourse with a woman who has irregular bleeding, إِلَّا مَا خَوْفَ الْعَنَتِ, unless you fear for yourself, meaning the men, unless you fear for yourself. What does that mean, fear for yourself? You're going to do something that's impermissible. Right. And it says, yustahabbu, that is voluntary, is recommended for a woman. Ghusluha li kulli salat. They say it's recommended actually for a woman to make a ghusl for every salat, but that might be difficult. But it's recommended if she's able. Now they're going to talk about postpartum bleeding. Postpartum bleeding in Islam, وَأَكْثَرُ مُدَّةَ النِّفَاسِ 40 يَوْمًا. If a woman has a baby, the longest days that she can, the days that are considered the days that she doesn't pray or fast after having a child is 40 days. The longest is 40 days. It says, وَمَتَى طَهُرَتْ قَبْلَهُ تَطَهَّرَتْ وَصَلَّتْ. They say that if, let's say she stops bleeding after 20 days. In this case, she makes a ghusl and she begins to pray after 20 days. But the longest is 40. What if she's bleeding after 40 days? It's irregular bleeding. Excellent. If she bleeds after 40 days, it's irregular bleeding. It says, يُكْرَهُ وَطْءُهَا قَبْلَ 40 بَعْدَ التَّطْهِيرِ. It says, it is hated to have intercourse with a woman after she has a child before 40 days after her, obviously after she made a ghusl. So what does that look like? Let's say, for example, your wife had a child. She's been bleeding for 25, 30 days. On the 30th day, she start praying again, and you want to be intimate with her. They say it's not recommended. It's hated for you to have intimacy with her before the 40 days. Yes. Yeah, it's about 40 days. But this is Islam. Yeah, mashallah, tabarakallah. طيب. Huh?
That's probably where they took it from.
That's probably what they took. Yeah, they probably did take it from Islam. A lot of stuff comes from Islam. It says, فَإِنْ عَوَدَهَا الدَّمْ فَمَشْكُوكْ فِيهِ. It says, let's say if the blood comes back. Let's say, for example, she stops bleeding for 20 days. 10 days, she's good. After 30 days, she starts bleeding again. They said, this blood here is doubtful. Is it nifas? Is it from postpartum? Is it from menses? Or is it from irregular bleeding? They said that this blood here is doubtful. Tasum wa tasali wa taqdi al-wajib. You fast, she prays, and she makes up whatever she missed that is wajib. So let's say, for example, if it's like 2 or 3 days, she does that. Even though she prays and she fasts, she makes it up again. This is according to the school of Imam Ahmed. وَهُوَ قَحِيد فِيمَا يَحِلُّ. And they said, the bleeding from nifas, postpartum bleeding, is similar to the blood from menses. فِيمَا يَحِلُّ. Right? So it says, وهو كحيض فيما يحل كالاستماع بما دون فرج. So if a woman is bleeding from postpartum bleeding, then it's similar to the blood from the menses, which means that you cannot be intimate with your spouse after she has childbirth for at least 40 days. It says, فيما يحرم. So it's haram for you to have intercourse with your wife after she has a child. If it's less than that time, it's also haram for her to fast, haram for her to pray. And it's haram for you to divorce her unless she asks for out. Now here it says, الطلاق بغير سؤالها. If a woman is in her having nifas and she's bleeding, it's haram for you to divorce her, say, hey, you're divorced, but it doesn't prevent her from asking you for a divorce, meaning a khul'a. Does that make sense? All right. وَيَجِبُ كَالْغُسْلُ كَفَّارًا, meaning she also has to make a ghusl. Once it's over, she has to make a ghusl, and whatever she missed from, obviously she can't pray. So the salat is removed from her. The obligation of the prayer is removed. But yeah. It says, وَيَسْقُطُ غَيْرَ عِدَّةِ وَالْبُلُوغِ. The salat is removed, and likewise the iddah, meaning that a woman, when she's in her nifas, obviously you can't divorce her until we can judge her by having her iddah, meaning that the divorce for the woman is based on what? The months or the menses. Her iddah is based on what? The menstruation cycle, right? And then they give an example here. It says, وَإِنْ وَلَدَتْ تَوْأَمَانْ فَأَوَّلُهُ نِفَاسٌ وَآخِرُهُ مِنْ أَوَّلِهِمَا. If a woman gives birth to twins, so let's say on one day she gave birth to one twin today, so our 40 days start right there. Then 5 days later, for example, or 3 days later, she gives birth to another twin. The other twin didn't come out till the ulama come up with these scenarios. The other twin didn't come out until 5 days later or 3 days later. When does the 40 days start? After the last one or with the first one? With the first one. Everything goes back to the first one. And that's the last of the book of menses. And I know for a fact this is not clear to a lot of people. It's not. But I hope it gave some insight. Some insight. If you hold on to those principles, it'll help you navigate through a lot of it. Remember, the longest amount of time for a mens is how long? 15 days. The least amount of time between two menses is how long? The least amount of time between two menses is 13 days. The least amount of time a mens can be is 1 day. If you hold on to those principles, the women, if you hold on to that, it'll help you navigate through. It'll help you navigate through. Each woman has their own special situation. There are women, for example, that take birth control. They say, okay, she doesn't get her mens because she's on birth control or whatever is going on with her. Does she count as a woman that doesn't get her mens? The women that do not get their mens, then their iddah period is with months, not with menses. The only time the months are used is for women who do not get their mens. For a woman that do not get their mens. Yes.
What's the period? If they don't get it.
What do you mean, what's the period? What's the iddah period if a woman doesn't get her mens? It's months, 3 months. 3 months.
It's a lot of sisters in society who've been divorced incorrect.
Oh, it's a lot of sisters that have been divorced based on bid'ah. We already said that. What concept?
Not the concept, this rule. That if
What rule?
The 15 days, like say for instance, if she has a menstrual cycle and she had, and it's like it's every 2 months. If her menstrual is like every 2 months, if it comes like every 2 months, and then it's like that's like 6 months.
Yeah, so some women, they were actually have their iddah period for, it might last 6 months. 6 months. So the brother, you will still be responsible for 6 months taking care of her. He's like, hold up, brother. No, I don't like that position. I want the 3-month position. Right? No, I'm telling you, that's what brothers do. No, that's too much. 6 months? He's shaking his head like, no. Sometimes it might be 9 months. She might get her mints every 3 months. Yes.
A sister wanted to know, for those who are married to men in prison, would this question be for you or for Abu Sajid class? How would you go about divorcing? So is it the same way?
You gotta ask Abu Sajid.
Yeah.
He's on tomorrow, inshallah. Ask him all the questions, inshallah, about divorce. Matter of fact, he's coming out now.
No, but it's still pertaining.
There you go. Brother Imam. Why you have to come out and tell me that? Stuff for the law. No, but what was the question? What's the question?
If a sister is married to a brother in prison.
If a sister is married to a brother in prison.
Does the mints?
Oh, you mean is her iddah period the same?
Right.
Yes. Yes, that's easy. Yes, her iddah period is the same. That means 3 menstrual cycles. 3 menstrual cycles if you get your mints, in 3 months if you do not. That was easy. I spared him on that one. Yes.
So bid'ah is an innovation, right?
Bid'ah is an innovation. Yes.
And actions through that they can't, but they're not accepted, all right?
Good question. So the brother said, if a person commits a bid'ah, are those actions accepted? Yes or no? Yes or no? No, they're not accepted, huh? Sorry, I didn't say, he said no. You asked me. I didn't say no. There's a book called Zaad Al-Mustaq'ni from Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. And in this book, he talks about people celebrating the birthday of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he said that celebrating the birthday of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam is a bid'ah. It's a what? Bid'ah, right? So he said that the bid'ah, they won't be rewarded for that bid'ah, but it's possible that Allah can reward them because of their love of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam from a different angle. This is considered being just. It's difficult for a person to say, just because a person divorced his wife in a bid'ah, it's sinful, but does it waqa'ah? Many of the ulama say that it counts. So if you took the premise that even though it's a bid'ah, it don't count, that means all those divorces wouldn't count. Where the majority of the ulama of Islam say that if a person divorced a wife during a bid'ah, it counts, but you have to take her back.
So the divorce counted, but you got to be married.
They say the divorce count, and they have to take her back based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's where the ulama differ on. Do you have to take her back, or was it recommended to take her back? And if you take her back, that divorce counts as a divorce. But that's a whole subject. Inshallah, the Sheikh will cover that. Inshallah.
Because I'm like, I get, like, say one person doing this, like, it's easy to have that one situation. But even over
what one situation? What are you talking about?
In general, like
general what? What are you talking about?
So because it's marriage, and like how all the marriages, they would have to take, the husbands would have to take the wife back if they divorce her in that situation. So it was like, just because a lot of people did it, that don't mean you don't have to take it back. You still have to take it back if you did it.
That's if you hold that position that you have to take her back.
So it's like,
yeah, a lot of it's not black and white. A lot of times we want Islam to be black and white, but it's not. A lot of times there's a lot of areas that's not black and white. Yeah, I'm sorry, what were you saying? Any other questions? Sisters, any questions? Right. So that our next class, we will be starting the book of Salat. We'll be starting the book of Salat. Next week, we will not have class next week. I'm just letting everybody know right now. Next week, Monday and Thursday, we'll not have class. I'll be out of town, inshallah, so we won't have class. We'll start, inshallah, after that, bi'idhnillah. Any questions about this? The mens.
Pertaining to the things that the woman can't do when she's on her meds, are you gonna go over this, or you just?
I think we already. You want me to go over it again?
No, I mean I have it, like I have what they are, but one of the ones was read the Quran.
So it's a difference of opinion on that. Some of the ulama mentioned if a woman's memorizing Quran, like she goes to tahfidh, or she's in school, or this is part of the curriculum, they say that a sister should put gloves on if she's going to touch the mushaf. So yeah, there's a difference of opinion, but we're just mentioning according to the madhab, this is the general ruling on it. However, many of the scholars they look at it from different angles, but that was one of the things that the early man mentioned. Another one is coming in the masjid. Many of the scholars of Islam say that women should not come into the masjid. Now, I don't know if many of you we went through some principles of usul fiqh, right? In Islam, we have two types of rulings. Does anyone know what those rulings are? In Islam, a ruling could be one or two things. Either it's ta'abbudi or mu'allal. Ta'abbudi means we hear and we obey, and we don't know the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated it. For example, we pray 4 raka'at for Salatul Isha, 2 out loud and 2 silent. Why? Why do we have 2 out loud, and why are there 2 silent? This is called ta'abbudi, meaning we were not given the reasoning behind it. We were not given the reasoning behind it. So therefore, we can't look at that salat and come up with a new salat and say, okay, we're going to do it like this, qiyasan. We can't make analytical deduction on it, right? Does that make sense? Then we have other rulings where it's mu'allal, which means the reason for the legislation is known. If we know the reason for the legislation, the thing that makes that thing prohibited is possible for us to apply it to something else. An example of which would be, you will find nowhere in the Quran that you can't smoke weed. There's no ayah, there's no hadith. But based off the ruling of drinking alcohol, the principle says, al-hukm yadurru ma'illatihi wujudan wa'adaman. That the reason that made alcohol prohibited, if you find that reason in something else, then that other thing provides, it takes the same ruling. Why? Because we know the reason why alcohol is made impermissible. You follow? All right, let's move on to the women in their menses being in the masjid. During that time, they said that it's impermissible for the women to come in the masjid when they're on their menses. Why? Because the reason that the scholars mention is because they're afraid that some talawuth means they're afraid that the masjid will be saturated with blood. Well, nowadays, there are things in place that will prevent that from happening. So based on that, some of the scholars of Islam say that that doesn't necessarily apply now. Whereas some say, no, it does. The ones that say it don't apply, they say because they have things now that will prevent a woman from bleeding in the masjid, right? But during that time, it wasn't the same. It may have been somewhat different. Does that make sense? So then, when we look at Islam, it's very important to understand that Islam has rules and regulations. If we know the reason for the legislation, then it's possible for scholars to make analytical deduction and apply the reasoning for that to something else. If we don't know the reason for the legislation, then it is not permissible for us to make analytical deduction based on that ruling and for something else if we don't know why Allah even legislated it. Is that clear? That's it. Any other questions? Any other questions, sisters? Right, we're going to stop with that. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.